I wasn't supposed to be there at night. It was written clearly in my contract. Work hours from 6 in the evening to 11, no access beyond Section 0, and under no circumstances enter the restricted archives. Yet on that Thursday, a little past midnight, I found myself standing in front of the heavy iron door marked with a faded black stencil. Section 0. 3 weeks before that moment, I had taken the job at the Municipal Archive Office of Volgograd. The year was 1977, and the city still bore its post-war scars like fresh bruises under a thin layer of paint. I had returned from military service the year before, tried my hand at teaching, but the money was poor and the nights too quiet. I found an ad in a back corner of a local newspaper, looking for a night assistant at the archive on Gagarina Street. Nothing special. Filing, cataloging, basic clerical work. The building was old, pre-revolutionary, brick and limestone, with arched windows and heavy wooden doors reinforced with metal bands. The corridors inside were narrow, always dimly lit, and lined with iron shelves that groaned under the weight of history. The electric system was outdated. Some areas still relied on gas lamps. The head archivist, Mikhail Viktorovich Savelyev, was a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers and a pale face like unbaked dough. He spoke little, except to remind me of two things: fill the logs meticulously and never enter Section 0. They had locked it. A physical key stored in a rusted lockbox bolted inside a wall safe in Mikhail's office. Still, something about that corridor leading to the forbidden wing itched under my skin. It felt colder, even in the peak of autumn. The floorboards creaked differently. On some nights, the lights above it flickered more than usual. That Thursday night, the storm outside had rattled the windows. Rain struck the roof like handfuls of nails thrown by God himself. I had just finished checking the inventory for the 9th floor's second sub-basement when I heard it. A faint knocking. It wasn't the kind of noise you could mistake for pipes or vermin. It was deliberate. 3 slow, evenly spaced knocks. Then silence. Then a voice. "Is anyone there?" It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't panicked. Just a flat, neutral question spoken in a calm, mild voice, muffled by several inches of concrete and a solid metal door. I froze. My flashlight flickered for a moment. I wanted to believe it was my imagination. Or maybe one of the custodians playing a trick, though I had never seen anyone joke around in that place. The knocking came again. "Is anyone there?" I stood in front of Section 0's door. The paint was chipped, the air smelled of rust. My fingertips touched the cold surface. Without thinking, truly without understanding why, I made my way back upstairs to Savelyev's office. The lockbox was there, exactly as I remembered it. The key, old brass with a worn tag, was inside. And then, as though guided by something outside myself, I returned to the door, inserted the key. It turned with resistance. The hinges screamed as I pushed it open. Inside? Nothing. Just a room. A large, bare chamber with rows of filing cabinets, a steel table in the center, and a flickering overhead lamp that must have been untouched for decades. Dust hung in the air. The walls were gray concrete, and the floor was lined with cracked linoleum. No people, no voice, no explanation. I waited in silence for maybe 10 minutes, then shut the door, locked it again, and went back to my station. I didn't log the entry. I didn't tell anyone the next morning. But the changes began the following day. On the edge of my usual filing desk, I found a thin gray folder. Its surface was clean, too clean for something supposedly buried deep in the archives. The label read, Case number 141A, date March 3rd, 1963. I opened it. Inside, a transcript of an interrogation. The name listed, Stepan Mikhailovich Antonov, my full name. The place, Internal Affairs Committee, Regional Office. The offense, ideological subversion, suspicion of anti-Soviet activities. I thought it was a mistake. Some strange coincidence, a case of name confusion, but then I saw the photograph. It was me, black and white, sitting in a metal chair. hands on the table. A man standing across from me, face blurred in motion. My expression was blank, my eyes glassy. But it was undeniably my face. Except I was born in 1954. In 1963, I was a child of 9. I spent the rest of the day searching the database for the case. Nothing. No digital reference, no hard copy listed. Savalev claimed to have no knowledge of it. He suggested it was probably a misfiled item from another region. The next night, another folder appeared. Different case, different date, same subject. Stepan Mikhailovich Antonov. This time the charge was unauthorized correspondence with foreign agents. Again, photos. Again, me. Older this time, with faint lines on my face that I hadn't earned yet. Always in the same chair. Always in that same concrete room. It didn't stop. Each night, I found a new folder. Always marked with red pencil, always with perfect, unstained documents. The paper didn't smell like old archives. It smelled like fresh ink, as though printed only hours ago. On the 7th day, I received one with a cassette tape inside. A reel-to-reel magnetic strip marked Session 7. I managed to find an old player in the supply room. The voice was static-ridden, but I recognized my own speech patterns. I don't remember being taken. I was just walking home. Then the noise. Then the light. A low male voice interrupted. What light? A pause. Then I spoke again, shakier. The one that burned from behind my eyes. After that, I stopped bringing the folders home. I kept them hidden inside an unused cabinet in the western wing. I began scanning the older documents in the archive, searching for any mention of the room I kept seeing in the photos. It matched no interrogation room used in the Volgograd region. I even checked old blueprints of the building. No such chamber existed on file. On the 12th night, I returned to Section 0. The keyhole was rusted again, as if never used. Inside the same room. Same table. But this time, a folder already waited on the table. And the light overhead turned on the moment I entered. I took the folder, walked out, locked the door. But as I turned the corridor, I heard it again. The same voice. Is anyone there? I didn't answer. Not this time. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, because I had started to notice something worse. In the photos, I was aging. Slowly, subtly, from one file to the next. And I had no memory of ever being there. I began recording everything. Every folder, every timestamp, every minute of those long and increasingly intolerable nights. Not in the official logs, of course. In a black leather-bound notebook I carried hidden beneath the lining of my overcoat. The folders kept coming, always placed exactly where I would find them, never too early, never late. They arrived between 2 and 3 in the morning, often while I stepped away to the break room or to check the northern stacks, as though someone was watching and knew my routine down to the second. On the 14th night, I arrived earlier than usual. I didn't check the logs. I didn't speak to Savaliev. I went directly to Section 0. I stood in front of it for a long time, staring at the door, the flickering light above it, the worn brass key in my hand. I wanted to catch the thing, the person, the mechanism, whatever it was, that kept placing these documents. But the room was empty as always. Just the steel table, the overhead lamp, and the cold that stung beneath my skin. This time, I decided to leave the door open. I took a chair from the corridor, placed it facing the room, and sat there from midnight to 4 in the morning. My flashlight died at 2. My thermos ran dry by 3. At 4, I stood, stretching my legs, and walked 10 paces to the stairwell for no more than 30 seconds. When I returned, the folder was there, on the table, fresh. I heard no footsteps, no movement, just silence, and the sickening knowledge that it had appeared only when I turned my back. This one was thicker than the others. Over 200 pages. Mostly transcripts of interrogations, but with scattered reports from medical officers and a new kind of document I hadn't seen before, psychiatric evaluations. The author, Major Pavel Ivanovich Grebnev, military psychologist stationed at a classified site labeled only as Facility Number 12B. Date, July of 1964. The subject was me, again, but in this file, I was described as unresponsive, restrained for extended periods, exhibiting what they called temporally delusional episodes. There were no dates of birth listed, only reference codes. I started checking names in the reports. Grebnev, Colonel Rybalko, Nurse Karpova. Some were real. I found personnel files from declassified Cold War dossiers. Others were blank ghosts, not listed anywhere. That same day, I visited the City Archive's public annex and bribed a clerk for access to the military subdivision files from the 60s. Buried under a stack of chemical storage reports, I found a single, water-damaged requisition form stamped with the insignia of the KGB's 5th Directorate. It referenced psychological isolation protocols with shipping manifests for 7 individuals, all unnamed, bound for Volgograd Sector C, which no longer existed on any current map. Back in the archive, Section 0 remained open. The next folder arrived without me leaving my post. I watched the room the entire night. Didn't move more than a step from the doorframe, but still, when I blinked, when I looked down to light another cigarette, the file was there. That one broke me. Because it had a photograph not taken in the concrete room. This one was outside. A street in winter, a brick wall with Soviet propaganda posters peeling at the corners, and standing by the curb. Me. Not a doppelganger. Not some man who looked similar. It was me in the coat I had worn last week, holding the same satchel I used now. The photo was dated January 20th, 1965. I stared at it until my hands shook. There was no explanation anymore, not one that followed logic or science. I took the folder, marched into Savaliev's office, and demanded answers. He looked up slowly from his ledger, not surprised, not confused, just tired. He told me I wasn't the first to see the folders. Others had before me. Some left after the first few. Some tried to burn them, but they always returned. Some began appearing in their homes, their cars, their own mailboxes. One man went mad trying to record all of it, covered his apartment walls in photos and transcripts. They found him in a ditch outside the city in 1971, clutching a shredded case file in each hand. "We don't talk about it," Savaliev said. "We don't interfere. We do our work. We don't look too deep." I asked why he didn't tell me sooner. He lit a cigarette, exhaled, and said, "You looked like someone who wouldn't listen anyway." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood something worse than fear. I wasn't discovering the truth. I was becoming a part of it. The folders were not a record. They were a construction, and someone, or something, was building a case around me, one file at a time. I started keeping the folders in a suitcase hidden in a maintenance closet on the 3rd floor. I labeled them manually, not trusting the cataloging system. There were already 19. I noticed something strange as I reviewed the interrogation transcripts. They often referenced events I hadn't lived through, protests that never happened, technologies that didn't exist. One transcript mentioned a riot in Leningrad in 1972, crushed by armored units from the Interior Ministry. But I found no mention of it in any newspaper archive, no state record, not even in restricted sources. The language was bureaucratic, impersonal, but beneath it pulsed something deeper. Someone was trying to warn me, or test me. And then, on the 23rd night, the folder changed. No date, no case number, just a single sentence typed on the first page. "You must remember what you did." Nothing else. I read it 100 times. My fingers left sweat stains on the paper. I checked the back. Blank. I held it up to the light. No watermark, no code. The folder weighed nothing, and yet it felt heavier than all the others. That night, I dreamed of the room, but not empty. In the dream, it was filled with people, silent, all sitting, all looking at me. And in front of me, on the table, was a folder still closed. I woke with blood on my gums, as though I had clenched my jaw all night. I began recording everything, every folder, every timestamp, every minute of those long and increasingly intolerable nights. Not in the official logs, of course. In a black leather-bound notebook I carried hidden beneath the lining of my overcoat. The folders kept coming, always placed exactly where I would find them, never too early, never late. They arrived between 2 and 3 in the morning, often while I stepped away to the break room or to check the northern stacks, as though someone was watching and knew my routine down to the second. On the 14th night, I arrived earlier than usual. I didn't check the logs. I didn't speak to Saveliev. I went directly to Section 0. I stood in front of it for a long time, staring at the door, the flickering light above it, the worn brass key in my hand. I wanted to catch the thing, the person, the mechanism, whatever it was, that kept placing these documents, but the room was empty as always. Just the steel table, the overhead lamp, and the cold that stung beneath my skin. This time, I decided to leave the door open. I took a chair from the corridor, placed it facing the room, and sat there from midnight to 4 in the morning. My flashlight died at 2. My thermos ran dry by 3. At 4, I stood stretching my legs and walked 10 paces to the stairwell for no more than 30 seconds. When I returned, the folder was there, on the table, fresh. I heard no footsteps, no movement, just silence, and the sickening knowledge that it had appeared only when I turned my back. This one was thicker than the others, over 200 pages, mostly transcripts of interrogations, but with scattered reports from medical officers and a new kind of document I hadn't seen before, psychiatric evaluations. The author, Major Pavel Ivanovich Grebnev, military psychologist stationed at a classified site labeled only as Facility Number 12B. Date, July of 1964. The subject was me again. But in this file, I was described as unresponsive, restrained for extended periods, exhibiting what they called temporally delusional episodes. There were no dates of birth listed, only reference codes. I started checking names in the reports. Grebnev, Colonel Rybalko, Nurse Karpova. Some were real. I found personnel files from declassified Cold War dossiers. Others were blank ghosts, not listed anywhere. That same day, I visited the City Archive's public annex and bribed a clerk for access to the military subdivision files from the 60s. Buried under a stack of chemical storage reports, I found a single, water-damaged requisition form stamped with the insignia of the KGB's 5th Directorate. It referenced psychological isolation protocols with shipping manifests for 7 individuals, all unnamed, bound for Volgograd Sector C, which no longer existed on any current map. Back in the archive, Section 0 remained open. The next folder arrived without me leaving my post. I watched the room the entire night, didn't move more than a step from the doorframe. But still, when I blinked, when I looked down to light another cigarette, the file was there. That one broke me, because it had a photograph not taken in the concrete room. This one was outside, a street in winter, a brick wall with Soviet propaganda posters peeling at the corners, and standing by the curb. Me, not a doppelganger, not some man who looked similar. It was me in the coat I had worn last week, holding the same satchel I use now. The photo was dated January 20th, 1965. I stared at it until my hands shook. There was no explanation anymore, not one that followed logic or science. I took the folder, marched into Savaliev's office, and demanded answers. He looked up slowly from his ledger, not surprised, not confused, just tired. He told me I wasn't the first to see the folders. Others had before me. Some left after the first few, some tried to burn them, but they always returned. Some began appearing in their homes, their cars, their own mailboxes. One man went mad trying to record all of it, covered his apartment walls in photos and transcripts. They found him in a ditch outside the city in 1971, clutching a shredded case file in each hand. "We don't talk about it," Saveliev said. "We don't interfere. We do our work. We don't look too deep." I asked why he didn't tell me sooner. He lit a cigarette, exhaled, and said, "You looked like someone who wouldn't listen anyway." That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood something worse than fear. I wasn't discovering the truth. I was becoming a part of it. The folders were not a record. They were a construction, and someone, or something, was building a case around me, one file at a time. I started keeping the folders in a suitcase hidden in a maintenance closet on the 3rd floor. I labeled them manually, not trusting the cataloging system. There were already 19. I noticed something strange as I reviewed the interrogation transcripts. They often referenced events I hadn't lived through, protests that never happened, technologies that didn't exist. One transcript mentioned a riot in Leningrad in 1972, crushed by armored units from the Interior Ministry, but I found no mention of it in any newspaper archive, no state record, not even in restricted sources. The language was bureaucratic, impersonal, but beneath it pulsed something deeper. Someone was trying to warn me, or test me. And then, on the 23rd night, the folder changed. No date, no case number, just a single sentence typed on the first page. "You must remember what you did." Nothing else. I read it 100 times. My fingers left sweat stains on the paper. I checked the back. Blank. I held it up to the light. No watermark, no code. The folder weighed nothing, and yet it felt heavier than all the others. That night, I dreamed of the room, but not empty. In the dream, it was filled with people, silent, all sitting, all looking at me, and in front of me on the table was a folder still closed. I woke with blood on my gums, as though I had clenched my jaw all night. After that night, I stopped leaving the archive at all. I brought canned food, a portable stove hidden in an old toolbox, and a blanket I kept rolled behind the western shelves. The walls of the archive became my only reality, windowless, humming with the low throb of the ventilation system and the brittle echo of my footsteps. Section 0 was no longer a mystery. It was a presence, a gravity well that drew the rest of the building toward it, silently and inevitably. I began noticing other irregularities. The clocks on the 3rd floor ran 15 minutes slower than the ones in the basement. My watch, a gift from my late uncle, a simple mechanical zvezda, gained or lost time erratically every night, no matter how often I wound it. The telephone in the security booth would ring once, precisely at 3:15 each morning, and stop. No one ever answered it. One night, during a routine corridor inspection, I found a folder not on the table, but in the stairwell, on the 2nd step from the landing. It had my full name again, my address, and a carbon copy of a requisition order signed with my forged signature. The order was dated 2 weeks into the future and referenced relocation for non-compliance. I brought it to Saveliev, demanding an explanation, but he only stared at it blankly, then muttered that it was probably misfiled, and walked away. That same week, a new janitor started working the morning shift, an old man with a limp and thick white hair who refused to speak. He moved silently, never made eye contact, and always finished cleaning Section 0 before I returned in the morning. I never once saw him enter or leave the room. On the 27th night, something changed. I was reviewing folder 24, a bundle of handwritten transcripts in badly faded pencil, when I noticed one page was still warm to the touch. I pressed it to my cheek. It felt like sun-warmed glass. The text on that page was not from the 60s. It was dated January the 2nd, 1989, and listed a subject under the alias Korshin Mikhail, born 1942, presumed dead with a red stamp, reactivated. The notes detailed Korshin's last known location as interior containment site near Volgograd, but described phenomena consistent with what I had seen in Section 0: missing time, hallucinations, files appearing unlogged. I looked up Korshin's name in old registry books. Nothing but a typed name card appeared in the staff directory slot outside the archive's break room the next morning. M. Korshin, night technician. No one else seemed to notice it. I removed it and burned it in a metal waste bin in the courtyard. The next day, it was back, with fresh ink and a slightly different typeface. I tore the directory down completely. Savelyev replaced it within hours without comment. I began suspecting the folders weren't being placed at all, not physically, that perhaps they were growing, emerging like tumors from the building itself. The walls were stained in places I hadn't noticed before, blotches like dampness that never dried. I once found a piece of metal behind a filing cabinet, an old Soviet dog tag etched with a number sequence that didn't correspond to any known military format. When I brought it near the folders, the paper trembled ever so slightly. There was a frequency I could hear sometimes at night, low, mechanical, almost like a tuning fork vibrating through concrete. It emanated strongest from Section 0, but it echoed through the ventilation shafts and between the floors. I recorded it once on a borrowed reel-to-reel, but when I played it back, the tape was blank, not silent, but physically unwritten, as if sound had passed over it but left no impression. I played the same tape later in my apartment and heard a voice whispering numbers, very faintly, with long pauses between each digit. I played it for Savelyev, but when I did, there was nothing. The numbers didn't play unless I was alone. The voice always stopped at the same number, 27. I started dreaming of a corridor that didn't exist in the building. Dark, lined with filing cabinets on both sides, all of them open, with air moving between them like wind through teeth. Sometimes I would hear someone weeping at the far end, but no matter how far I walked, the figure stayed out of reach. On the 28th night, the folder did not appear. I waited all night, pacing between the stacks, checking and rechecking every shelf. At 4 in the morning, I returned to Section 0. It was darker than usual, the light above the table flickering, then dead. In the center of the table, not a folder, but a reel of tape, magnetic, unmarked, the casing greasy with something like old engine oil. I touched it and the lights came back on. The tape hissed softly without being connected to anything. I took it home and played it on my old reel deck. At first, static. Then, the same voice from the previous tape, but this time clear, rhythmic, and unmistakably my own. You are not who you think. You are not when you think. Record ends. Protocol resumes. The reel snapped at the end, coiling back violently, and I sat in silence for a long time. The power went out across my entire block that night. The next day, the newspaper listed a transformer fault. But I knew better. I hadn't left the archive. My apartment hadn't existed since 1979, when the address was condemned due to foundation collapse. I visited the city registrar. They said no such address had ever existed. I returned home anyway and found my keys still fit the lock. Everything started to blur after that. Days folded into nights without edge or memory. And I began to suspect that time inside the archive no longer moved in alignment with time outside. The folders resumed arriving, but with increasing irregularity. Sometimes 2 in a night, sometimes none for days, but always reappearing with such disturbing precision that I could no longer convince myself they weren't aware of my thoughts. I placed a small piece of thread across the entrance to Section 0 before leaving it one morning. When I returned, the thread was intact, but the air inside smelled faintly of sulfur and old meat, and the fluorescent lamp had been unscrewed and carefully laid beside the bulb socket, as if by someone cautious not to make a sound. The next file was sealed with a wax emblem I did not recognize, a circular crest bearing the letters UPI and a series of runes or symbols arranged around it. Inside was a thin sheaf of papers marked Recovered Testimony, unauthorized personnel file, Operation Glass. The contents were neither interrogation nor report, but a fragmented account written in the margins of military transport manifests and ration slips, pieced together in a disjointed narrative describing a failed attempt to relocate something referred to only as the subject, who had demonstrated a refusal to remain in temporal stability. The handwriting changed mid-document, and some words were repeated over and over. He was already here. No center. Remember the shape. The folder was signed at the bottom, not with a name, but a fingerprint. And when I compared it to my own, the loops and ridges matched perfectly. That night, while reviewing older folders, I noticed that the order of documents was shifting when I looked away, and photographs began to show subtle differences. In one, a soldier's cap had an unfamiliar insignia. In another, the shadows fell in the wrong direction despite the same listed time of day. I laid them side by side and saw that certain patterns repeated across multiple photos, not in content, but in structure, like someone embedding visual codes between unrelated images. On a hunch, I began charting the page numbers and comparing the file IDs against the Soviet numerical codex used by the Ministry of Defense in the late 50s. What emerged was a grid, a map of cross-referenced entries all converging on one central figure labeled only as individual theta, and the numbers encoded in that name matched my military service file from 2 decades ago, long thought lost. I tried contacting a former colleague who served with me in Smolensk during that period, but the number was disconnected. When I went to the address listed in the old registry, a woman answered and told me no one of that name had ever lived there, and that the building had been reconstructed after a fire in 1972. I checked public records. No fire reported, no construction permits, and yet the bricks on the outer wall bore stamps from 1973. Back at the archive, I found a new key in my locker. Heavy, iron, with a 4-digit number etched in one side. I had never seen it before, but something in me understood it was meant for the locked sub-basement below Section 0. That part of the archive had been sealed since at least the late 60s, the door rusted and marked with white paint in a cross pattern, and I had never tried to open it, but the key fit. The room below was cavernous and lined with shelves that went 30 meters deep, all filled with crates sealed in lead and marked in Cyrillic. Do not unseal. Directive 28. Military purpose only. I walked between the crates, flashlight flickering, and found a rusted desk in the center with a single typewriter bolted to it. The keys were mismatched, some from different makes, and when I pressed one, it jammed instantly, but paper was already inside. One line had been typed, "You are late." I stumbled backward, dropped the flashlight, and for a moment, all the lights in the upper levels flickered. I could hear the distant thrum again, that frequency, but now accompanied by something else, like mechanical breathing through pipes. When I climbed back up, I found the main archive in disarray. Files strewn across the floors, cabinets open, the air thick with dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The night log was still intact, but someone had written a new entry in red pencil beneath mine. "Stop interfering. This is not your role." I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and sat alone in the entrance lobby until morning, listening to the sound of paper rustling in a room that should have been silent. Saveliev didn't show up that day. Neither did the janitor. I was the only living soul in the building, and yet I did not feel alone. At exactly noon, the phone in the reception booth rang twice. I picked it up. Nothing. No dial tone. Only silence. Then, faintly, a voice, old and rasped, speaking my name with a familiarity that chilled me deeper than anything prior. "You've almost completed the cycle. Do you remember the lake?" I hung up, hands trembling, but something in the back of my mind unlocked. A flash of reeds, ice, the crunch of boots in snow, and someone standing across a frozen shoreline holding a folder just like the one I'd been receiving. I wrote it all down in my private journal and locked it in the supply cabinet. That evening, when I returned from a brief walk outside to clear my head, the cabinet was open. and the journal gone. In its place, a single new folder with one photograph inside, the supply cabinet, and me staring directly into the camera. Date stamped, February 13th, 1961. After the discovery of the photograph, I couldn't sleep. I stopped trying. The archive seemed to absorb me whole, its routines replacing my own instincts. I began operating more like a mechanism than a man, eating only when I felt faint, resting only when I blacked out in the chair by the service elevator. Time detached. No clocks held consistency anymore, and my watch, once trustworthy, now ticked backward for long stretches, then froze entirely. I brought in a transistor radio to pick up some outside signal, some affirmation of reality, but all it produced was dead air or, at random intervals, the Soviet national anthem from a version I didn't recognize, slightly slower, sung in a female voice without orchestration. On the night of March 4th, I found a second key taped beneath the desk in the security office. It was newer, silver, marked only with a stamped B3. It did not fit any door I had seen. That same night, a new folder arrived, unmarked, almost an afterthought, slipped between the pages of an older case on internal corruption within the Leningrad Administrative Commission. Inside was a single document, a map, hand-drawn, ink faded, corners scorched, but unmistakably a floor plan of the archive. Yet the layout was wrong. It showed rooms that didn't exist and stairwells that descended far deeper than the 3 basement levels I knew. Section 0 was labeled not as a room, but as a node. Stabilization Hub, Obery KZN. I photocopied the page and marked the discrepancies in red pencil. As I compared it to the building's official blueprints, I noticed strange annotations written in the margins of the original plans. She must not exit, and in another place, limit interaction to audio layer only. The handwriting matched none of the archive's registered engineers. I showed the copy to Savelyev the next day, but he stared at me like a stranger and said, "We don't keep floor plans for restricted levels. You're not qualified for that file group." Then he added with unnatural calm, "And we no longer keep staff records for technicians with Category B clearance. Are you still assigned to Category A?" I nodded, though I had never been told about any such classification. That same evening, while inspecting the bottom of Shaft 3, an unused freight elevator sealed since 1966, I saw movement behind the mesh. Not shadows, but flickers of light, like reflections of a candle flame on glass, and the metal bars were warm to the touch, despite the cold below-ground temperature. I returned to my desk and found the next folder already waiting, not on the table, but slid carefully beneath my chair. It bore my initials only. DV. Handwritten in cursive, I recognized, but couldn't place. The contents were worse than usual. Scans of old identity documents, 3 photographs, all in black and white, showing an interrogation cell from different angles. In the center, always me. One photo had me seated at the table, eyes closed, wires taped to my temples. Another had me writing with my left hand, which I have never been able to do, while a man in a long coat stood behind me, face blurred not by age or motion, but as if smudged by intent. The third photo was empty, but bore a fresh fingerprint pressed into the corner in what looked like dried blood. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. I instead wandered through the Western Archive halls and found myself in an aisle I didn't recall ever cataloging. The folder labels were wrong. Alphabetical characters I'd never seen, names with no vowels, some purely numerical. One folder simply read Helios REM. Inside, a page of clinical notes described a subject exposed to prolonged auditory distortions at infrasonic levels, exhibiting symptoms including memory displacement, inversion of spatial perception, and in one case, cessation of heartbeat without immediate biological death. I turned the page and found a list of locations: Vorkuta, Lubyanka, Pripyat, and the final entry, my own city. No date was listed for the last. I tore the sheet from the file, pocketed it, and burned the folder in the boiler chute. The smoke came out blue. The next morning, my hand was covered in small blisters, though I never touched the fire. Later that week, I began experiencing what I can only describe as overlay. Moments where my vision split, showing two versions of the same room at once. In one, the archive was as I knew it, gray, dusty, lifeless. In the other, it was intact, clean, brightly lit, filled with men in uniform sorting documents I'd never seen. When the overlay ended, one folder from that version remained in my hands. It was labeled Hotel Deviat, Department 9. That division was officially dissolved in 1952 after a scandal involving unauthorized psychic experiments, or so the rumor went. But the file was dated March 6, 1989, and stamped active. That same day, I tried to leave the archive for the first time in over a week. I walked up the main stairs, through the vestibule, and into the outer airlock, only to find the front doors bricked over from the inside. Not locked, bricked, as though part of a wall, seamless with the stone around them. I stood there for nearly half an hour, staring at them, pressing my palms against the mortar. Then I walked back in. On the way down, I passed a mirror I hadn't seen before, square, mounted at head height. My reflection blinked 3 seconds after I did. That was the last night I tried to leave. I began keeping track of time, not with a clock or calendar, but by counting the appearance of new folders. The days had stopped meaning anything. Light from outside no longer poured through the small windows in the western corridor. I covered them with a paper, but when I peeled it back, there was only concrete behind the glass. The archive was sealing itself, or something else was doing it. And I no longer trusted that I was inside a building in the traditional sense. On the 7th appearance of a file marked only by the number 07, I found inside not a report or document, but an audio tape, reel to reel, with no label. I had no equipment for playback, but after searching for nearly 4 hours, I found a small audio lab tucked between the microfilm room and the sealed chemistry annex, a space I'd never seen before and which did not exist on any map. Dust suggested no one had entered in decades. The tape player was functional. I threaded the reel and hit play. At first, there was only static. Then, a soft, rhythmic clicking. Mechanical but uneven, like a finger tapping on glass, and then a voice. Male, middle-aged, with an accent I couldn't place. It said my name 3 times, paused, then whispered, "You're standing where he died. Open the case. Look beneath the floor." The voice was calm, slow, like reading a bedtime story. They buried the first one in concrete, but it didn't hold. The second one they isolated, used lead and prayer. You are the third. You have always been the third. I stopped the tape and left it running as I walked away. When I returned, it had unspooled entirely. The voice never repeated. It never resumed. The tape was blank after the 6th minute, but on the table beside it sat a rusted nameplate I was certain hadn't been there before. It read, D. Vlasov, Monitoring Unit. The paint on the plate was chipped and dark, as if exposed to heat. My name, my position. But no such unit had ever existed within the archival registry. I knew that because I had checked the personnel logs dozens of times, and by then, I had stopped expecting them to remain unchanged. Each time I opened the red file cabinet near my locker, the contents were slightly different. Some folders gone, others returned with pages shuffled, like someone had been consulting them at night. Once, I found a sheet folded inside a case on agricultural equipment audits from 1958, completely unrelated, but it bore a message in typewritten Russian, "Do not open the 6th level. She hears names." I had never seen a 6th level, but I began to feel a pull toward the freight shaft near Sector G, the one supposedly sealed since the 1960s. One night, the door stood slightly ajar. No lock. Just a dark hollow descending into pitch black, the air pouring out of it damp and cold like a crypt. I brought a torch and descended slowly. The stairs were rusted, narrow, steep. Walls changed texture halfway down, from industrial cement to something older, lined with bricks stamped with foreign letters, some in Latin, some Slavic, some unrecognizable. The sixth level was not a floor. It was a corridor, a tunnel stretching beyond the physical boundary of the building. The deeper I went, the more the air changed, gaining a coppery taste like blood and ozone. My torch flickered and briefly died. In that moment of darkness, I heard whispering. Not words, but wet, breathless movements close to my ears, as though someone pressed their lips near my skull and exhaled. The light returned. The tunnel ended in a chamber lit by a single hanging bulb, swinging slightly though no draft moved. In the center stood a glass case, cracked and fogged with age. Inside, a set of documents, sealed in wax, marked in handwritten script, Vlasov Intercepts, Phase 3. I did not open it. I don't know why. Something told me I shouldn't. Not yet. I returned to the surface, or what passed for it. After that night, all clocks in the building began showing different times, each one off by minutes, sometimes hours. I began to catalog the discrepancies, and patterns emerged. Certain rooms always lagged behind. Section C consistently ran 41 minutes slower than my wristwatch. Sector A ran faster. I theorized a kind of spatial distortion, but couldn't explain how it functioned only inside the archive. No external source could account for it. One morning, I brought a mechanical stopwatch from home and left it in Sector C. When I returned, 8 hours later, the watch had rusted through and stopped at 13 minutes. The metal itself had softened, like corroded aluminum. That same evening, I found a message scratched into the door of Section 0. Not painted, but carved deep into the wood with something sharp. They cannot follow past the 5th turn. I didn't understand it then. Later, I would. For now, I was unraveling. My memory began showing holes. I'd returned to a cabinet I was sure I had emptied, only to find it full. I began forgetting the names of my former supervisors. When I called my sister, one of the few connections I still had, she told me we hadn't spoken in over 2 years, but I remembered a call only weeks earlier. My apartment key no longer fit my front door. I tried 3 times. Each attempt, the key felt slightly heavier, until the 3rd time it broke in the lock. I spent that night on the archive's cot in the first aid station. There was no one else in the building, or so I thought. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the fire alarm. No fire, no smoke. Just the wail of a siren not used since Soviet drills in the early 1980s. It stopped on its own after 12 minutes. I followed the sound to the maintenance corridor behind the records vault. The walls were covered in water damage, and for the first time I saw black mold growing in strange circular patterns. Symmetrical, almost mathematical. In the center of the mold was a single white flower, pressed into the concrete as if grown from within. I touched it. It dissolved into dust, and then I heard footsteps, but not the echo of boots. Bare feet. Soft. Deliberate. I turned, saw nothing, but the folders in my arms began to vibrate. And from beneath the pages, one fell free. A photograph, glossy, undeveloped, still damp. I placed it on the table under the red light of the developing lamp. Slowly, an image formed. My face, not as I was, but aged, pale, eyes wide in terror, mouth open as if screaming, standing in this very hallway. Same walls, same mold, same flower at my feet. Date marked April the 12th, 1963. The same cursed year again. I spent that entire night sitting motionless at the end of the hallway where the photograph had fallen. I couldn't make sense of the image, not just because it showed me in that corridor, aged and in panic, but because it was chemically developed on paper that hadn't been manufactured since the early 60s. The serial markings on the back were in the format used by military labs in the Khrushchev era. I didn't own film like that. No one used it anymore, and no one had access to a dark room in the archive but me. I checked the room logs. No entries. The padlock on the developer cabinet was still sealed with my name tag, unbroken, yet the image existed. And worse, its timestamp matched the date on one of the oldest unexplained documents in the Null sector. A memo listing the names of potential narrative contaminants involved in what the archivists then called non-sequential continuity breaches. I was the fourth name. The other three were crossed out. The names were unfamiliar to me. Markov, V.I., Altanbekov, R.A., Rozanov, P.G. No department listings, no birth dates. Just their full names and the designation absorbed, confirmed. I don't know what that meant, and I had no way to ask. I never met anyone in the archive except on paperwork. I began to believe I was the only living person ever working night shifts. One evening, I stayed until morning on purpose, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone, a janitor, technician, anyone from administration. But the hallways remained still. Phones rang, but no one answered. When I walked into the director's office, the light was on. But the room was empty, and the desk calendar was turned to June of 1971. I flipped the pages forward, every month hand-marked with strange notations. Red circles on the 13th, blue crosses on the 23rd, each page bearing the same faint symbol in the corner. A triangle intersected by a vertical line and a dot where they met. I began seeing this mark in more places, etched lightly into the margins of old reports, burned into the corner of a map of the archive's old blueprint from 1959, stamped onto the seal of a personnel document bearing my name, dated before my birth. These symbols weren't recent additions. The ink had aged, cracked, faded into the fibers of paper like they'd always been there. At some point, I gave up trying to understand the logic of what was happening and started documenting it instead. I wrote by hand in a hard-bound notebook I kept hidden inside an unused radio locker near Section G. Each entry included exact times, weather outside when known, room temperatures, and descriptions of any new folders or phenomena. The more I wrote, the more certain I became that the building was responding to my actions. Entire cabinets began appearing in rooms where I had stood for long periods. One night, after standing for over 2 hours by the freight lift shaft, I returned the next morning to find a steel cart filled with torn elevator schematics marked with words I hadn't seen in years. Opasno, ne rekomenduemo dla wchoda. And beneath it, in a more hurried, handwritten script, Lift ne idiot vniz, on uchodit obratno. That phrasing disturbed me more than any photograph. The implication of direction, not just physical, but temporal, or perhaps psychological. I stopped using the elevator. I stopped using anything mechanical if I could help it. On a few occasions, I even refused to turn on the lights, preferring to navigate with a single candle taken from the memorial shelf in the reception corridor. A place I now avoided entirely, since one night I found the names on the brass plaques rearranged. Mine had been added at the bottom, dated May 17, 1979. That was in 2 weeks' time. Or maybe it had already passed. I no longer trusted the calendar. The most disturbing event took place 3 nights later, when I returned to the Section 0 door and found it ajar, not by accident. Someone had wedged it open with a thick bundle of old law books from the 1954 District Legal Annex. They were not catalogued to this building. Inside Section 0, the room had changed. It was no longer a single corridor of shelves. It had become a circular chamber, as if the walls had bent inward. The shelves were curved, stacked vertically like a beehive. In the center, a chair, wooden, heavy, with leather straps bolted to the arms, an interrogation seat. Behind it, an old reel-to-reel recorder, already running. The reels turned silently. I leaned in. No sound. But when I touched the microphone, the machine stopped, then started again, then stopped. It responded to contact. When I backed away, it began to spin in reverse. I left the room, but the sound of the machine followed me for hours, a soft magnetic whirring, constant and high-pitched. That night, I found a file placed directly on my desk. No folder, no markings, just a document, yellowed with time, typewritten in uneven lines. At the top, the words, "Session Transcript, Vladimirsky Case, Vlasov D." Beneath it, the log of an interview, the voice identified as mine. Date, February 3rd, 1963. The questions were familiar. I'd asked them before, during my student days, part of my thesis on memory perception and false confession, but I had never spoken to anyone named Vladimirsky. The responses chilled me. The subject described locations in the archive that did not exist yet. The concrete walled room behind the power junction, the fourth sub-basement below Sector H. Even the sealed stairwell I had never dared to open. Then came this phrase, repeated 4 times in the transcript. He doesn't remember being born here, but the building remembers him. After reading that, I no longer slept, not even in the safe parts of the building. I would drift into waking dreams while sitting upright, and always the same vision would come. The long hallway, endless doors on either side, each marked by a different number, but all of them silent. Then the sound, soft, wet breathing behind one of the doors. Not trying to escape, listening, waiting. One night, I woke to find my own hands had been writing while I slept. A pen in my fingers, notes on the reverse of an old receipt, written in block Cyrillic. Do not tell her your name. No context, no idea who her was, but that same phrase appeared again, scratched into the underside of a desk in Section C 2 days later. I began to feel as though I were being prepared. By whom, I didn't know, but certain elements began to feel ritualistic. Always the same days, always the 11th, the 13th, and the 23rd. On each of them, the same scent in the air, burning oil and old wood. On the 23rd, something different happened. I found a narrow passage open behind a supply rack in Sector F, a passage I had checked hundreds of times. It now led to a locked vault, a different material, not wood, not steel. Some kind of stone door, carved with those same triangle symbols, but in perfect geometric formation, like an equation. I placed my hand on the center of the door and heard a click, but the door did not open. Instead, the lights in the corridor flickered, and for the first time, I saw a figure at the end of the hall, not moving, not walking, just there, as if it had always been there. Watching, I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure at the end of the hallway remained still. Too still. There was no sway, no hint of breath or pulse, no interaction with the draft that always ran down from the ventilation shaft near Sector F. It stood with a posture so exact, so mechanically correct, it felt more like a cutout or a projection than a person, but it cast a shadow. A long, slanted shadow across the tiles, one that moved slightly even though the figure didn't. I blinked, and in that second, it was closer. Not walking, just closer by 3 tiles. I didn't blink again. I stared, unbreathing, until my eyes began to sting. I couldn't look away. My hand reached slowly to the side, brushing the edge of the nearby metal shelf for orientation. When I dared to glance, just for a breath, the figure was gone. But its shadow remained for another moment, stretched on the floor, unmoving, as though scorched into the surface like after a flash detonation. Then it too vanished. I didn't report it. There was no one left to report to. The main phone line had gone silent days ago. The clocks in the entire building were no longer synchronized. Each room showed a different time, and every few hours they reversed, spinning backwards for a few minutes. The last functioning wall calendar in Sector B still showed 1964. I stopped trying to correct anything. All I did now was observe, document, and exist from shift to shift. I began finding my own handwriting in folders I'd never seen before, catalogued in years that predated my birth. The photographs became more frequent. In one, I stood in front of the burned-out records annex that hadn't existed in over 30 years. My expression, terrified, looking off camera. Another showed me shaking hands with a man I now recognized from old staff documents. Rozanov PG, the same name crossed out in the list of absorbed. I traced that photo back. It was logged as evidence in an internal investigation dated November the 3rd, 1967. No reason given, but someone had written in red pencil, "Repeating phase, reinterrogate if recovered." On the final night, the power failed completely. The entire building went dark at once. No warning. Even the emergency lights didn't flicker on. Only the red diode on the master terminal in Sector N blinked slowly, like a heartbeat. I took my candle, now a melted stub, and went to Section 0. The door was closed again, but not locked. Inside, the room had changed once more. The circular chamber was gone. Now it was a long corridor lined with glass like an observation tunnel. On the other side of the glass, dozens of desks. Dozens of people sitting in silence, writing. Some wore uniforms I didn't recognize. Some wore the archivist's gray coat like mine. And one, I swear to whatever remains of my rational mind, one wore my face. He was older, paler, eyes sunken, but the same scar on the left temple from the accident when I was 12. He looked up, directly at me, and smiled. Then he picked up a folder and slid it across his desk. It passed under the glass, as if the barrier weren't there. I stepped forward and picked it up. Inside were pages typed in the exact format I'd used in my private logs. But it was not my handwriting. It was cleaner, more refined, and the details described events I had not yet experienced. Attempted breach of stairwell, 17 June, failed. Subject remains unaware of full loop scope. Below that, a signature, my name, and the date, tomorrow. I dropped the folder and turned back, but the hallway behind me was gone. Instead, another room. Stone walls, high ceiling, and that symbol again. The triangle with the line and the dot etched deep into the floor. In the center, the interrogation chair. Empty. A tape recorder stood beside it, already spinning. I sat. I didn't remember choosing to. It was like the room had tilted toward that chair, and I had simply rolled into place. The machine clicked, and a voice began. Not mine. Not quite, but close. It asked questions, very calm, very cold. Name? I tried to answer, but nothing came. Date of arrival? I whispered the year. The machine stopped. Incorrect, it said. Repeat phase. The lights in the room flickered, and I felt something shift under the floor, like gears engaging. Then I was alone again, or I had always been. I stood and backed away, heart hammering. The door now a wall, the wall now a door, everything rearranged by an intelligence I didn't understand. I found myself running. I don't remember how far. I remember only the sound, a low hum behind me that grew louder with each turn, a mam-ta, like machinery or distant breathing. I reached the freight elevator shaft. It was open, pitch dark. I looked down and saw lights below, faint, flickering, like fire. Then, a shape rising, fast. I ran again, back to the front office, to the director's room. It was open. On the desk, a single sheet of paper, a requisition for burial, stamped with my name. Date, today, cause of death, unspecified. Witness signature, Rozanov PG. I turned the page over. One word handwritten in ink so black it looked wet. Remember. That was when I heard the bell. The same bell that rang every night at 23:40, the sound I had dismissed as a mechanical glitch. But tonight, it rang louder, deeper. It echoed through the foundation, and I finally understood. It wasn't announcing anything. It was calling something. In the last moments before I passed out, or transitioned, or whatever term they'd use, I remember seeing the lights in the archive all flicker on, all at once, even the bulbs I'd seen smashed years ago, the corridors lit like floodlights. And from the end of every hallway, every section, every sealed zone, they stepped out. Not people, not anymore. Echoes of personnel records, ghosts of misfiled names, bureaucratic remnants made flesh by repetition and neglect. They came not to punish, not to kill, but to continue. That was the word that kept appearing on old reports. Продолжить. No explanation, just that. Continue. I woke hours later in the office lobby. Daylight filtered through the glass, but everything was silent. Dust had settled thickly across the floors, as if no one had walked them in decades. My clothes were unchanged, but my badge had a different number. My file drawer was gone. The memorial wall was blank. The photo of the staff on the wall now had one extra figure. Me, in the back. Staring forward, eyes dull. That was 4 days ago. I haven't left. I don't think I can. I walk the corridors now, not searching for answers, just for orientation. Time slips here. Names slip. The only truth I know is that the archive remembers. It documents. It stores. It doesn't forget. And it doesn't release what it absorbs. I found one last message on the desk tonight, a faded scrap of paper under the typewriter. In my own handwriting or something close to it, "You are not the first. You are just the clearest copy." And now, the bell rings again.